Hello, welcome to you all. Welcome to this very special afternoon's panel discussion as part of our continuing celebrations of the First Master's life, Sir John Cockcroft. Some of you will have been here last night when we had a lovely event where the family have formally handed over Sir John's personal papers to the archives, just back there. This afternoon, we're going to start off. The first half of the session will be more technical, I think, and then we will get on to the sort of more personal aspects of Sir John's life. And we've got a stellar lineup of speakers, starting with Rolf Heuer, who is the former Director General of CERN, stepped down a couple of years ago, I think. And he is going to be trying to compress into about 20 to 25 minutes the development of particle physics from the Cavendish in 1932 to international collaboration at the LHC at CERN. So that's quite a tall order. But immediately after him, and we'll take questions at the end of the session, so immediately after Rolf, we'll have Dame Sue Eon, who is also trying to compress an awful lot of information into a short space of time, nuclear power in the UK from Calder Hall to Hinkley Point. And so we'll take those two talks running after each other, and then we will have a Q&A session on the pair of them. And then there's a brief tea break, and after that we have three further speakers, and again we'll take the three talks and some questions at the end. So over to you, Rolf.
Thank you. Yeah, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor for me to open this session to honor Sir John Cockcroft in his participation or his life towards nuclear and particle physics. The title you have already heard, but in order to bring you to 1932, let's start before 1932, because that's quite important. Because Rutherford's experiment revealed the structure of the atom. And I think that was a very important start. So you see here on the left, you see at that time nuclear and particle physics could be a single person show. That changed in the course of the years. But what was behind this experiment? He had a natural source of radioactive particles, so-called alpha particles, and he shot them onto a thin gold foil. And what did he see? He saw that the scattering of the particles was not uniform, so he could conclude from that the gold foil was essentially empty. It consisted mainly of some hard cores in the gold foil, and these were afterwards identified as the nuclei of the atoms. Yeah? So that was the very first experiment where he could identify that the atom really had a structure. But then, of course, curious as he was, how to get deeper into the microcosm, how to get deeper into the atom. Now, that you can only do when you have a better resolution. A better resolution means you need a microscope, a better microscope. How to get a better microscope with particles? Well, you need higher energy of the particles. But a natural source doesn't give you higher energy. So, what to do? Well, you need an artificial means of creating particles with a velocity or with an energy which is high enough to overcome the charge of the nucleus to penetrate into the nucleus. Oops. Fortunately, 8 years ago, John Cockcroft had become a research student at the Cavendish laboratory. And I think he was already under the supervision of Rutherford at that time, and he did his PhD under the supervision of Rutherford. And John Cockcroft realized that the desired effect to get closer into the nucleus could be achieved with protons. These are the nuclei of the hydrogen atom, with an energy of, I think, 200 or 300,000 electron volts. Together with Allibone and Walton, they built what became known then as a Cockcroft-Walton accelerator, and I think here, if I'm not mistaken, this might be one of the very first ones which they have built. And the idea was to have particles really accelerated through a high voltage, so it was a technical masterpiece at that time to make such a sort of linear accelerator at that time. So that's another early, that was the real piece, I think. Cockcroft and Walton then began operating the accelerator in 1932, and they were bombarding very light atoms, lithium and beryllium, with their high-energy protons. And here, I didn't find a photo of Cockcroft taking data, but at least Walton is supposed to take data.
My father's on the right, on the bottom left-hand corner.
Ah, this one. That's Cockcroft. Okay. Well, you must know. It's difficult for me to identify. Okay, fine. So I will change that for the next talk. Walton taking data and Cockcroft not wanting to watch him or something like this. I don't know. Okay. And they were very fast in their results, but they expected to see photons, gamma rays, because they saw some neutral energy, which other scientists had reported, but they didn't find them. They didn't find photons. And earlier in the same year, James Chadwick, he had discovered the neutron. And he convinced them, I think, that's what they saw were neutrons. So Rutherford, Cockcroft, and Walton, they got convinced by his arguments. They did the calculations. They were convinced it was neutrons. And they produced very quickly a letter for Nature, and I think it was published in April 34, if I'm not mistaken. 32, yes, sorry. A letter in Nature in which they announced their results. And because it was not photons, which could have been just an excited state of a nucleus, because it was neutrons, it was clear that they have disintegrated, that they have split the atom. So they have disintegrated the atomic nucleus, and that was the first artificial disintegration of a nucleus. So 1932 was a miracle year at Cavendish, I must say. First, the discovery of the neutron by Chadwick, and a few months later, the splitting of the atom by Cockcroft and Walton. And to my mind, this was a start of a fantastic journey of nuclear and later on particle physics. And what do you need for such a journey? Well, it was clear one of the most important tools of nuclear and particle science is the particle accelerator. So when first Cockcroft-Walton, in the same year, cyclotrons were invented by Lawrence in the US, and then later on, synchrotrons. And with the synchrotrons, you could go to higher and higher energy. So the energy of the particles increased steadily over the years. With higher energy, the resolution power of these microscopes, because these accelerators are nothing else than microscopes, increased also steadily. So people could probe deeper and deeper into the microcosm. So going further, people realized we need higher energy accelerators, larger laboratories, and that is a very important step now, need to go beyond nations' borders at some stage. So international collaboration became very, very important. And that brings me to the most international and maybe most known laboratory. You see, I skipped a few years. But in 20 minutes, for 20 minutes, I have to skip a few years. So CERN was founded in 1954 by 12 European states. By the way, UK was one of the founding members. That's not so often. Okay. But I think it was also somebody called John Cockcroft who was behind the scenes working for that. Yeah. But you have to imagine, 1954 was the foundation, but the first discussion started 1949. Now you have to imagine, Europe was in ruins. But then you need just a handful of visionary diplomats and a handful of visionary scientists. You bring them together, they resonate, and out of this resonance, CERN comes out. And it took only 5 years from the first idea to the foundation of CERN. Today, I think that would be just impossible. So this was a fantastic achievement. And at that time, it was clearly science for peace, because many countries were sitting around the table who beforehand, a few years earlier, they're not very much on ease with each other. Today, CERN has 22 member states. We have, oh, no, I'm no longer we. CERN has nearly 4,000 staff and other paid personnel and 13,000 scientific users coming to CERN to do their research. You have here all the member states, associate member states, etc. But you will see CERN was originally a European laboratory. And you see in the member states all European countries, but there's one country which is not following the normal definition of Europe. So that's Israel. And in the associate member states, you have Pakistan, India, Ukraine. So what we did in 2010, that was during my term, we redefined the E in CERN from Europe to everywhere. That means all countries, independent of their geographical location, could become members of CERN. So, 1954, they were going beyond European national borders. Today, we are going beyond European borders. We are going global. And I think that's very, very important, because science is becoming global. So from the Cavendish, 1932, to CERN, 1954 and beyond, is a journey of nuclear and particle physics, which was accompanied and shaped by John Cockcroft. Because he was, from the very beginning, for 7 years, a member of the so-called Scientific Policy Committee, the highest science committee at CERN. And he was also the British delegate to Council from 1959 to 1961. So he was, from the very beginning, fully behind CERN and the whole adventure of CERN. So what's the mission of CERN? We want to push back the frontiers of knowledge, understand the secrets, or at least part of the secrets of the Big Bang. What was matter like within the first moments of the universe's existence? You cannot do that without developing new technologies for accelerators, for detectors. Also in IT, the web was born at CERN, 1989, and it spins off into medicine and diagnosis and therapy. It's obvious that it is a fantastic training ground for scientists and engineers of tomorrow. And each country, every country is missing scientists and engineers. And it's also obvious you cannot do it alone. You unite people from different countries and different cultures. And I think that is also something which John Cockcroft had in mind, this going international, this uniting people. Crossing borders in the mind, I must say. We need that today more than ever. So CERN is a European Intergovernmental Organization, but it's globally used. It's an infrastructure which belongs to all its member states. And it's an example of what Europe and its partners can achieve when everybody is working together. So 1954, the European reconstruction, 1980, East came to the West, and today the LHC brings together more than 8,000 scientists. And the key message here is, from the very beginning of the existence of CERN, it's peaceful cooperation at the forefront of science and independent of cultural and national differences. So today, it is really global collaboration. And I'm personally convinced that that's the future. You cannot do big science without global collaboration. And that shows you the distribution of all scientific users of CERN by nationality. And you see that's more than 13,000. 2/3 are coming from the member states, and the others are coming from the rest of the world. And you see essentially all continents are very well represented. Here, they have other problems. But we are also, or CERN is doing a lot in order to attract more people here by teacher programs, etc., etc. So to enthuse the young people. And that's the age distribution of these scientific users. And you see it peaks at 26. It's mainly young people. And that's fantastic for the field. And this is quite some time ago that we did that diagram. Today, the peak would be much higher at 26 because now we have CERN has more than 3,000 PhD students performing their PhD at the LHC experiments. So the peak would be even higher. So that's fantastic. So why do they come? Because they want to address a scientific challenge, to understand at least part of the very first moments of our universe after the Big Bang. It started with a tremendously energetic, hot and very small spot, expanding over 14 billion years to today's size of 10 to the 28 centimeter, today's temperature of 2.7 degrees above absolute zero. Now, how can you look now, how can you understand the first moments? You can look into the history. Now, the history, you use astrophysics or astroparticle physics, and they use telescopes. With the telescopes, you look into the history of the universe. But there you have a problem. Once you look with photons, you hit a wall around 380,000 years after the Big Bang. Because in the first 380,000 years, the universe was still so hot so that no matter could form because all the energy was immediately absorbed again. No photon could come out. At 380,000 years roughly, the universe was already cool enough so that photons could come out. And these are the earliest photons you are seeing with your telescopes. So what to do? How to cross this hidden wall? Well, you use particle physics. And particle physics uses microscopes. These are the accelerators, not to look back, but to reproduce the conditions of the early universe. And that's what we have learned in the past 50 years, 60 years. That we are consisting out of quarks and leptons. These are the matter particles. So we have reduced the amount of particles out of which everything is built. We have reduced the number to 12. And we have 4 types of force particles which do the interaction between these matter particles. And this is all we need to explain us. We all consist only out of 2 quarks and 1 electron. Only out of 3 particles. Nonetheless, we are so different. So nature has produced more of these quarks, more of these leptons. We still don't know exactly why we have so many, but at least we know that the visible world is essentially built out only of these 3 types. And then you have the forces, the electromagnetic force, the strong force which holds the nuclei together, and the weak force which is partly responsible for the processes in the sun. But there's one question left over. Everything was tested over these decades with high precision. However, there was one crucial question left open. How do these elementary particles get their mass? Now, you might ask yourself, once you are not physicist, why should I be interested that these particles have mass? I can only tell you, you should be interested. Because if they would not have mass, you would not sit here. You would not exist. Because if they would be massless, they would travel through the universe with the velocity of light. And you could not form bound states. You could not form matter. So you should be interested why these guys have mass. Okay. And that could be the solution, the so-called Higgs boson. This guy represents the mechanism which gives mass to all these particles. If it exists, it was the last missing cornerstone of the Standard Model. So, you need, in order to find this Higgs boson, you need an even more powerful microscope, and the Large Hadron Collider is a super microscope. It has 4 huge eyes, so in scientific language, it's the highest energy accelerator in the world, with 4 huge detectors. And with this microscope, we are getting closest to the Big Bang, less than 10 to the minus 12 seconds, 1/millionth of a millionth of a second, and we are breaking the wall of the hidden universe in this way. So, it's the largest, maybe, or one of the largest scientific instruments ever built. It's an accelerator of 27 kilometers circumference, some 100 meters underground. It collides protons to reproduce the conditions a millionth of a second after the birth of the universe. And it does it 40 million times a second. And then you have the 4 huge experiments to register what happens in these collisions. So these are the 4 basic, some of the questions which the LHC could address. Will we understand what was the state of matter before protons and neutrons were formed? That means when there was only quarks and the force particles, the gluons. Is the Higgs particle really responsible for giving mass to these elementary particles? Why has antimatter and matter not completely destroyed each other? We are in a matter-dominated universe. Where is the antimatter and why? And will we find possibly the particles that make up the mysterious dark matter? And what's dark energy? The visible matter is only 5% of the whole matter and energy density of the universe. 95% are still dark to us. And this after more than 50 years of research. We have a lot of work in front of us. So, but to design and to construct such a project, you need many thousands of technicians, engineers, and physicists from all over the world, from many different disciplines, to develop new technologies, develop new engineering concepts, and to work together over decades. It's a tremendous amount. It's fantastic. And the question is, can that work? Well, because we need the fastest racetrack on the planet. Trillions of protons are bunched in up to nearly 3,000 packets and race around the 27-kilometer ring in opposite directions, and they do it 11,000 times a second. And they are kept on track by more than 1,200 superconducting dipole magnets, which keep them on their trajectory. In order to have these high-field magnets, we need to create one of the coldest places in the universe, because we have an operating temperature of the magnets at about minus 271 degrees, just 1.9 degree above absolute zero. So the LHC is colder than outer space. And it uses superfluid helium, 80 tons, to cool the magnets down to that temperature. So up to 3,000 packets of protons, these are pencils of sub-millimeter width and roughly the length of a knitting needle, in a distance of 7.5 meters, are running around. So you have more than 10 to the 11 protons per packet, and they travel with a high speed. And during the acceleration of the particles, each beam has to be increased by approximately 300 megajoule within a period of 20 minutes. And during that time, the protons travel a distance further than the round trip to the sun. Do you all know what 300 megajoule mean? Well, two beams together have 720 megajoule, and 700 megajoule melt 1 ton of copper. Or each beam represents 90 kilograms of TNT. If you lose the beam, you are lost. So you better have finely controlled feedback loops which maintain position and stability of the packets of the protons to high precision. And we have shown that this is possible over the past 5, 6, 7 years. So what happens then? You have the proton beams in opposite directions. At some places, you collide these bunches of protons. Now, when the protons collide, the quarks and the gluons in the proton interact with each other. They produce very, very high energy density, and then they produce particles, and you detect what happened in these collisions. In order to detect what happens in these collisions, you have 4 huge detectors built around the circumference. You have the 4 here. I just show this one, the biggest one. I can't read it, but it means 10 minutes. Okay, 2 minutes. Okay. So Atlas is the largest detector, 3,000 members from 40 countries, 3,000 members, at least 300, 400 professors, at least 300, 400 egos. But it works. So the empty space here needs to be equipped with instrumentation. And when it's instrumented, you have more than 100 million sensors, and they measure all the space coordinates of the particles with an accuracy of 0.1 millimeter over the entire volume. And what next? The protons collide inside this tube in the heart of the detector. And the question is, can this work? 1 billion pairs of protons interact per second. Hundreds of billions of particles are produced. We are looking for physics signals which are 10 to 11 orders of magnitude below the rate of all the signals together. To give an example, the number of humans is of the order of 10 to the 10. So the detector's job is to try to find the one person in all of humanity who meets a special set of criteria. That's the challenge. And it works. You know that we found 2012 the Higgs boson. Nobel Prize was given to Peter Higgs and François Englert. And now we have to study this Higgs boson because more than 20% of the universe are dark matter. And the properties of the Higgs could give indications of what dark matter could be. But there's more than science. And I quote the last paragraph of the editorial in The Guardian March 2015, when we switched on the LHC at the higher energy. The first sentence is physics, but then comes the partnership so far has spun off colossal technological and computing rewards. But that's not the point. The point is that Europe is working together in a thrilling intellectual exploration that can have no conceivable commercial or political payoff, but could, in some still intangible way, enlighten all humankind. In these otherwise murderous and mean-spirited times, that is something to salute. And I think that's still true today, unfortunately. It has to be true. So, what's the role of science? To innovate, to discover, to publish, and to share, and bring the world together. Thank you. That was only 1 minute.
Well, thanks very much indeed for that, Rolf. You're a hard act to follow. Great. Well, as Damon said at the outset, I'm going to try and compress into 20, 25 minutes the nuclear power journey, Windscale to Calder Hall, and actually Calder Hall to Hinkley Point and beyond, because I do want to say a little bit about and beyond in terms of the future. So, in terms of the contents, I'm going to talk a few historical facts, look at the chronology of the events, how we came to make the early choices that we did, particularly why we picked Magnox reactors early on, then look at the other systems, look at the key decisions in the 1960s and 70s, and then what happened after our electricity generating board was privatised. Okay, so after the war, the primary objective in the UK, as far as nuclear was concerned initially, was to get an atomic bomb, as it was at the time. And the Attlee government of the day decided to do that and to build what became the Windscale Piles in order to generate the plutonium that was required. So from the first decision in 1947 to the first fuel being loaded, it only took 3 years. So, you know, tremendous timeline to actually produce what was required. And then in 1957, there was a fire in Pile 1, which I'll come back to, which led to them being contaminated and the piles shut down. But the key player in the technical and engineering development of our early programme was down to Sir John Cockcroft. In 1944, he'd actually been seconded over to Canada to run the Canadian Atomic Energy Project, and he was the director of the Montreal and Chalk River Laboratories. And that's a personal link for me because as of last year, I became chair of the Scientific Advisory Board of the Chalk River Laboratories, which are now part of the Canadian Nuclear Laboratory, which used to be called Atomic Energy of Canada. So I feel that I have a link back there, as well as from his leadership of the United Kingdom Atomic Energy Establishment, which was the Atomic Energy Research Establishment, Harwell, when it was first set up. So Sir John returned to Britain to lead the UK's scientific endeavours in the nuclear world. Another man who was important at the time was Sir Christopher Hinton, who was charged with the industrialisation of the work that was being carried out at Harwell and getting the first piles and reactors built. And he was only 44 at the time that he was appointed as the head of the industrial group for atomic energy, with Sir John leading the scientific endeavours. So a lot of work done in the early days, small startup reactors, experimental reactors set up at Harwell, BEPO, the British Experimental Pile 0, where a lot of the first work was done, and choice of coolant. For the UK, it wasn't intended originally to have a gas coolant, but we had graphite moderated air-cooled piles because we couldn't get access to enough water cooling needed to cool the piles in the same way as the Americans had done. There were siting difficulties. They needed 30 million gallons a day of exceptionally pure water. There was a risk of loss of water coolant, and if you did the calculations on where it might be appropriate to site them, the only place that would have been okay in the UK was the northwest of Scotland, with Arisaig as top of the list. So had we pursued water as a coolant, then we might have had our early nuclear power stations built at Arisaig in Scotland. So the decision was taken to go with a gas coolant. And there were already challenges because the United States had passed what was called the McMahon Act, which meant that they wouldn't allow us to import any material from them, nor would they allow any further exchange of technical information. I mean, that was reversed some years later, but at the time, we had to make do with something else. So we imported ore from the Congo and purified it. Time was of the essence, and so from nothing except test tubes and lab trials, we built a radiochemical processing plant at Springfields near Preston to produce the fuel. So 2 years, 8 months after the original work started, the fuel was coming off the line at Springfields. Building the reactors was also a challenge. The site, Windscale, now called Sellafield, was a massive construction project. So moving large numbers of engineers and technologists and civil engineers to that part of West Cumbria was a challenge. The weight of the pile was a challenge. The recruitment difficulties in both supervisory and the craft workshop, and some poor quality workmanship that had to be redone. And then Wigner growth, a particular challenge, which distorts the graphite core, became an issue and was only found out after the thing had been built. So in order to accommodate it, the fuel had already been made, and in order to put it in the reactor, they had to discharge the fuel and clip by hand with metal clippers 1 million fins from the fuel elements in the space of 3 weeks in order to load the core, to make it go. So the pile design was very simple. It was a core, air-cooled at the time, uranium bars in aluminium cans. It was fueled manually. I'll show you a bit in a minute, with spent fuel falling directly into the cooling pond. But the very low operating temperature allowed the build-up of Wigner energy, another byproduct of that particular phenomenon. But heat was just up the stack and ejected to the atmosphere. So very simple design. Fortunately, and thanks to Sir John Cockcroft, filters were added after the original design for the chimneys. So the filters at the top were down to Sir John Cockcroft's insistence that there ought to be some protection just in case. Unfortunately, when the Windscale fire happened, most of the material discharged actually ended up in the filter banks at the top of the chimney piles there and wasn't ejected to atmosphere. So it was very crude. As you can see, when they loaded the fuel, they just pushed it in horizontally and shoved it a bit with scaffold poles. That was how the core was loaded. And to discharge, you just continued pushing, and it fell out at the other side and into the ponds that were next door to the reactor, which is why we've had somewhat of a challenge over the last decade or so in trying to retrieve that material from the ponds from which it was discharged. So we didn't give much thought to legacy management at the time. It was important to just get the plutonium. So what about Calder Hall? How did that originate? Well, Sir John Cockcroft, leading the team at Harwell, was convinced that you could generate electricity economically from nuclear power and that it was feasible. And so they started work on a project to prove that, and it was called the PIPPA project. And the idea was to use high-density graphite as a moderator, magnesium alloy for cladding rather than aluminium, and pressurized CO2 as a coolant rather than air. So that was the idea for Calder Hall. The team was assembled in 1952, and the design philosophy was, make it work. We don't want anything too complex, make it robust. And the original site was going to be East Yelland in Devon. But Hinton was required by the government to increase plutonium production, so he had to have a means to do that and didn't want to replicate the Windscale Piles. And so the decision was taken to put the new PIPPA project at Calder Hall in 1953. So the site of Calder Hall was chosen in 1953. And the Hinton guidelines were it has to be built quickly, it has to be successful, not clever, only make essential design changes. And they started to construct it in 1953. That's the construction site, and that's the Queen opening it in 1956. So from nothing to 4 operating reactors, it took 3 years, with the design being done at Warrington. So, one could argue that we've gone backwards when you look at what I'm going to show you now in terms of how long it takes to build a reactor. So the government were very excited. One of the drivers for a big program was that we couldn't mine coal fast enough to energize the post-war industrial Britain. And so the Scottish Electricity Board, which eventually became the CGB along with the BEA, came into being in 1955, and a long-term programme was legislated for in white papers, and they started to build them in 1957. So this was the build rate. As you can see, the build rates were still maintaining 3 to 4 years between start to finish. Will for the last one, because there's actually two turbine units there, took a bit longer. And they were going to continue building, but decided to switch to the advanced gas-cooled technology rather than the Magnox technology. But those are the stations that were built throughout the 1960s. So at that time frame, in terms of the UK's nuclear ambitions, these were the sites where there were power stations or research laboratories or test sites. So those are the Magnox stations that were built in that early period. Ilbury and Will for the last two, and then we exported two, one to Italy in Latina and one to Japan at Tokaimura. At the same time, also under Sir John's leadership, we were also developing something called the fast reactor. And there, the decision was taken to site it at Dounreay in 1946, and this is the early work at Dounreay, where everything had to be shipped. And led to the prototype fast reactor and the demonstration fast reactor, both sited at Dounreay, now both shut down and being decommissioned. So not only was the UK getting gas-cooled experience, it was also leading the world in fast reactor sodium-cooled expertise. Already spoken about Italy and Japan. At the same time, we were also looking at what next after Magnox. And the Windscale Advanced Gas-Cooled Reactor, WAGR, all that's left today is the dome. All the graphite and all the internals have been taken out and decommissioned. So it's a heritage asset that's preserved so that you can still see it on the Cumbrian coast. And these power consortia were set up to build a series of advanced gas-cooled reactors. Now, I don't want you to necessarily read the names, but just look at the slide. They're all different, you know. So every single reactor that was built was different from the one that was being built elsewhere in the country in order to accelerate the speed of build and to get some competition, which arguably didn't really benefit us in terms of series build. And these are the resulting reactors. They're the ones that are running today that give you and me our nuclear electricity down the wires and are currently producing 18% of the UK's electricity needs. We also toyed with high-temperature reactors, Dragon, built at Winfrith, and a steam-generating heavy water reactor that's a bit like a CANDU, not quite the same, but a bit like a CANDU, a Canadian-design reactor. So basically, with the Heinz 57 approach to nuclear, we built one of everything to try it out. We also had a fast test critical facility at Winfrith. So this is what civil nuclear power looked like in the UK until the 1990s, when we decided to buy from overseas and not progress our own internal technology anymore. So Magnox first series, the AGRs, like Heysham, and Sizewell are only pressurized water reactor at the moment. So with many technologies, they were either there as prototypes or demonstrators. The military program drove it originally, then Magnox, due to the fact that we couldn't get cheap enrichment. There was a heavy preference to start with for our technology, no standardization, and many different contractors. And then we get to the point where, well, what happens next? Because our AGRs, because we chose that technology, unfortunately, their design life, originally 25, 30 years with extension, makes it mean that they will retire in the next decade. Even with the extension that was allowed. The rest of the world chose light water reactors, and they last for 60 to 80 years, most of them 80 years these days. So we were unfortunate in that although they've been good workhorses, they don't last as long as light water reactors. So we've got to replace. But we lost almost 2 decades, right? Between the early 1990s and now, there's been no progress on moving forward in any large way with new nuclear power stations. The governments of the day thought renewables in the form of wind and solar would mean that we didn't need nuclear energy from about 1995 until about 2006-07. And it was only when the national policy statements published in 2009 that the way was paved for new investment. And that was fine because the government basically had no control now at all other than to pave the way and facilitate. It was all down to the private sector. And our issue was that British companies did not own any of our electricity generating network because the CEGB had been privatised and the owners of our electricity generating network were overseas utilities where decisions about what technology to deploy and whether to deploy it were overseas supervisory boards. So these were the utilities that were interested. I mean, to be fair, Scottish and Southern, which is British, and Centrica were originally interested. But all the rest of the utilities who were interested were overseas. EDF bought British Energy. Apologies to our Francophiles in the audience and to Ralph, but just a mild joke there. But EDF bought British Energy, which meant that they chose pressurized water technology to replace the existing reactors that they were allowed to replace. So pressurized water reactor technology and a design called the EPR, the European Pressurized Water Reactor. So the same as the design at Flamanville and at Olkiluoto in Finland. It's the biggest of the designs available and the most complex to construct. So it's complex, congested, heavy and non-repetitive. And the civil engineering challenge to construct is not insignificant. That's a photograph of Flamanville's base map before it was completed. Work has started on Hinkley Point C now. But interesting things were happening in the world. E.ON and RWE formed a joint venture to create Horizon Nuclear Power, and they owned the sites at Wilfer and Anglesey and Oldbury in Gloucestershire. But Fukushima happened, and Angela Merkel signalled German abandonment of nuclear energy, so E.ON and RWE pulled out. They sold it to Hitachi, and that meant that Hitachi had the right to build. Other significant events were in 2015, the Chinese investments in Hinkley Point C and their design at Bradwell, and Westinghouse going into Chapter 11 in the United States. I'll come back to that one. Because Hitachi bought RWE E.ON's Horizon, so that meant they decided to build boiling water reactors at Wilfer and Oldbury, and they're still waiting for the finance to appear on those reactors, Wilfer at first. It's good design. This is a site that has 7 of them. The 2 at the top are like the one that would be built at Wilfer. It's a site at Kashiwazaki, Kariwa in Japan. The other site was north of Sellafield called Moorside, and a company was created called NewGen that originally had Suez, Iberdrola, Vattenfall and Scottish and Southern in it. Iberdrola, Vattenfall, Scottish and Southern pulled out, and Toshiba bought the shares. Suez became Engie and agreed to put its shares to Toshiba earlier this year. Toshiba nearly went bankrupt because of Westinghouse's Chapter 11, so it's now for sale. And I'll come on to the implications of that in a minute. So they were originally going to build the Westinghouse AP1000 because Toshiba had bought that from the UK government. The UK government used to own Westinghouse in the late 90s, early 2000s, but they sold Westinghouse for $5.4 billion to Toshiba. And Toshiba now have it for sale. But their projects are going well. The Chinese projects are going well and will start up later this year. But their American projects have been in big trouble because of the difficulties in mobilizing the civil engineering workforce in the United States. This is the plant at Vogtle in Georgia. I wanted to show you this because this is the nuclear bit. The vessel being pushed down into the containment is the piece that holds the fuel. So all the fuel goes in there and generates your 1150 megawatts, and it sits in the containment vessel. So you could fit 1, 2, 3, probably about 12 vessels in this room, each with holding 1150 megawatts. So the complexity is in all the gubbins that goes around it, and the timeline became late, and the projects are, billions overrun, which is what caused the Westinghouse problems. So that means that because Westinghouse is for sale, Westinghouse is in Chapter 11 and NewGen is for sale, then we may well get Chinese reactors like Hualong 1 or Korean reactors like the one being built at Baraka to be built at Moorside, north of the Sellafield site, because the decision is in the hands of Toshiba and who gives them the best deal. Now, the Hualong 1 and the Korean AP1400, nothing wrong with it, they're being built successfully, but we have no say over what technology. Meanwhile, our government, fortunately, is still thinking about what next. And after a huge push from the research community and other companies, the desire to build small modular reactors instead of these big, large reactors that require a massive amount of civil engineering expertise is underway. And they are a multiplicity of offerings, some gas-cooled, some molten salt-cooled, some water-cooled. Who knows which ones will be successful? You know, all purport to have merits one way or the other. And hopefully our government will make a decision in the next month or so about funding the next steps in taking one or two of these advanced modular reactors forward. A tiny one that happens to be in the mix that is a UK design, you know, harks back to Cockcroft's original work in gas-cooled reactors. It's only 4 megawatts electrical, and it fits in the volume of 2 squash courts, and it's fueled for 5 years, and may well supply alternative to diesel backups on nuclear sites and to remote communities. So our national R&D programme, which Cockcroft I think would applaud now, although it's been 20 years in the making, looks at fuel, advanced reactors, recycle technology and waste management, looks at modelling and simulation, which is much greater now than it was in his day, at robotics, which is also much greater now than it was in his day, and at validating and verifying the designs that people have on offer. Not forgetting things like public engagement and watching what other people are up to. Okay, so we're lucky. We have world-leading research facilities. I won't go through them all, just to say that over the last decade, what the government has done is reinvest in our university base and in our laboratory facilities, having dismantled our national lab infrastructure. So we're not short of good facilities now. We're also not short of the excellent work that is possible to do in them. What we're short of is the programme money to encourage the scientists and engineers to actually work there. So if you wanted a career in the nuclear world right now, you couldn't be entering it at a better time, when we're likely to have a multiplicity of designs, some fantastic advanced reactor projects to work on, and the best modern facilities that you can have that are the envy of many in the world. Okay. And to wind up there, I'd just like to say, going back to Ralph's point, you know, about the early work that Cockcroft and his fellow workers, this describes some of the work that got to the splitting of the atom. Without Sir John and the early work that he had at Harwell, the nuclear power programme in the UK would never have happened in the first place. Thank you. We have about 10 minutes before tea break for you to quiz our speakers after their excellent presentations. I'm sure you're all much more expert now than you were at the start. And we have some roving mics.
Thank you. Colin Myerscough for Sue Iron. As you'll probably remember, Sue, I was fairly involved in some of the messes that happened in the 70s and 80s regarding nuclear, culminating, of course, in the abandonment of Hinkley B at the time for electricity privatisation. And I was fairly clear that it happened because nobody was in charge. We had the Atomic Energy Authority with its own interests. We had the CEGB with its own interests. After all, its aim was to generate electricity economically. I worked for them for a while. And there were ministers, various ministers, and their civil servants, most of whom had degrees in classics, who most of it, and the ministers certainly wanted a British nuclear solution. And when it became clear that Magnox and then AGR working very well, then we had a little bit of fun with the steam generating heavy water reactor you mentioned, before finally biting the bullet and saying, you know, the system which actually works is the water reactor. By that stage, Hinton had retired and Walter Marshall had come on the scene, and he had his own agenda, a very grandiose program, which was far beyond the resources of finance, and certainly beyond the resources of private finance, which was then high on the agenda. And that's how we ended up where we were, because nobody was really in charge. Nobody ever developed a coherent long-term program, and it's a pretty savage indictment of all involved, in my view. But there we are. That's where we are. That was where we are then, and here we are now with Hinkley B involving a strike price of £90 per megawatt hour. That's 9 pence a unit before it gets transmitted to the consumer, and you won't be paying more than about 15 per unit on your own bill.
Sorry, this is great, but can you ask the
but,
question?
You know, where are we actually going now when the wind generators are coming in at £60 a megawatt hour?
I would challenge the fairness of the analogy, because you have to look at what was the strike price for wind when the strike price for Hinkley was struck. So the Hornsea 1 wind farm, which was contracted at almost the same time as Hinkley, was actually contracted at £140 a megawatt hour. Hinkley's is 93.50 pounds per megawatt hour. So, you know, Hornsea 1 was much more expensive than Hinkley. Hornsea 2, which is what's been the subject of the news this last couple of weeks, fair enough, that's down at £50 a megawatt hour, but nobody expects the next nuclear stations to be as expensive as Hinkley. It's the biggest of the reactors. It's the most complex to build of the ones that are on offer. And the other point about the wind technology, all you're talking about is the strike price for the wind. You're not counting the strike price for the gas that has to be rolling all the time to back the wind when it doesn't blow. So, you know, I don't mind comparisons, provided we're actually looking at a level playing field.
Have we some other questions? There's one right at the back.
Yeah, my name's Bernie Walton. I'm actually a sort of maths undergraduate from the 70s, and I don't understand science, so this definitely will be a question as opposed to a diatribe. I was interested in Ralph's comment about, you know, the CERN mission becoming more international, but I wondered, does he really think that will happen? Because these big 4 questions you've got to answer, seems to me, naively, that it'd be better if the world works on them together. And I don't know if the US and the China and the Russians have parallel research going on that CERN are doing. Would it be better if everybody got together? And is that likely to happen, or is it better to have people doing competing research? What do you think?
First of all, there's only one CERN. There's nothing comparable in the rest of the world. But to work together doesn't mean that you don't compete. So you collaborate, and you can collaborate and compete at the same time. In these big experiments, the groups, of course, are collaborating to make the experiment a success. But internally, of course, they compete. If this group is working on some special process and this group is also working on the same special process, they are, of course, competing who has the best methodology, etc. And afterwards, they combine, or the best one wins. So it's competition and collaboration. And in order to build huge infrastructures, you need a lot of brain power, you need a lot of hands, you need a lot of resources. So I think it has to be global, but that does not exclude competition. Science needs competition. That's clear.
Thank you. Tim Chittenden. Question for Sue. For some 70 years or so, the British nuclear programme has been largely managing reactors designed and built in the UK with the technology owned by UK organisations, the design work done largely in the UK, and the design authorities owned by the UK. We're now looking to a future with a large selection of potentially foreign reactors, with a lot of that knowledge will be offshore. do you feel that we will have sufficient indigenous capability to own that risk over the next 50 or 60 years? And do you feel that there's sufficient investment in the research facilities and so forth you were mentioning to enable us to generate the knowledge we need to be safe operators?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the research facilities to support an ongoing nuclear mission, yes, I don't think that there's an issue with that. The point that you've raised about competence in operators, our regulator won't allow the operators to operate unless they have indigenous competence. So although the designs will have been done overseas, the knowledge that's inherent with those designs will have to be transferred to the UK as part of the package that goes ahead. It would be better if we post the first wave, which is already committed, we actually went for fleet build of the same design, so that you would get much more local competence in the operation of a single design, and the chance for the UK to actually upskill its high-end engineering and design base to be able to support that. So there's going to have to be more work on that front, I feel, certainly. But for the advanced reactors, which we may well end up pushing one or two forward with, and I would expect that technology base to be also owned by the UK, because if we're going to invest in advanced reactor development, then we want the IP generated here onshore, so that when you come to export, your value added and your value chain is a lot better. So I would expect for the future for there to be a lot more UK ownership of the designs being studied. There's another question.
As a non-physicist who just sort of reads about these things occasionally, the idea of dark matter and dark energy as the sort of ways of solving the problems with the standard model as the current sort of orthodoxy, what do you think the possibilities are that actually they're a sort of dead end, and some of the other sort of solutions that are being thought about at the moment might turn out to be a sort of cleaner way of patching things together?
I didn't catch the last part.
Well, I'm just wondering what you think the possibility that there might be solutions other than dark energy and dark matter as being a way of solving the problems with the standard model.
Well, the standard model has many problems. It doesn't tell you anything about the question of antimatter, why we are in a matter-dominated universe. It doesn't tell you why there is something in the universe which keeps the galaxies rotating and which deflects light without seeing anything. And the standard model doesn't tell anything about the expansion of the universe. Now, the most common belief in the research area at the moment is for the dark matter that these are particles which are essentially gravitational, act only gravitationally. Whenever you have a favorite model, you always have other theories in addition. But all these theories, they have to be so fine-tuned that they are not showing, at least in our energy range, which we have, where we have access to, that they don't show a deviation from the standard model predictions, because everything agrees with the standard model, despite the fact that we know there's something else over there. So that restricts the type of model you can invent. So I don't know what the solution will be. If I would know that, I would be a fantastic physicist, but I think I'm more a diplomat, meanwhile, but no, I don't know. It's very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of suggestion that maybe the assumption that mass is distributed evenly in the universe has sort of led to some of the current problems. Is that...
No, dark matter is everywhere, but it also clumps. It's very similar to normal matter, which also clumps, like stars, galaxies. But there's also matter in the rest of the universe, but it's very very small amount. So the assumption is that dark matter is everywhere, also here, but in very tiny amounts. But you don't feel anything. It's like with the neutrinos, but they cannot explain the amount of matter which is missing in our calculations.
Is that on? Yes. It says something when it is somewhat easier to understand the subatomic particles and the list you had than the spaghetti of acronyms and initials of all the companies involved in nuclear power. I think I'd rather work on the first. But coming to the second, hindsight is the only exact science, and it seemed implicit that there were mistakes made that you can see in the 50s and 60s. And I just wonder if we're having the precision feedback that CERN employ to make sure we don't make the same mistakes again in your industry.
It's a fair point. I mean, ideally, when you build more of the same, then you stand the chance of getting, much better feedback loops. And I guess the hope internationally was that if enough of certain designs were built as fleets, even though they're global fleets, it wouldn't matter whether you had different ones being built, say, on UK soil. I think that lessons are being learned internationally from the projects that are underway, but there's still a way to go. Most of the issues are in the construction of the plants. Issues with respect to operations tend not to be so because there is extremely good feedback there. There are organisations like WANA, the World Association of Nuclear Operators, which mean that there are extremely good feedback loops to alert operators to issues or deviations so that everybody can learn and make sure that the systems are continued to operate safely.
Ken, I think this would probably better be our last question.
A difficult one then. How heavily do you feel the hand of politics hanging over you, both internationally and nationally, given the very long-term nature of the projects you're engaged in, the fickleness of politics combined with the economic issues that have already been alluded to?
Well, in our case, we have a good history. Since 1954, we get the support from the many countries. What you have to avoid is that one or two countries decide to drop out, because then you might have a domino effect and then you have a problem. When I took over the Director General position at CERN, there was an economic crisis. Not when I was elected, but after that. So maybe there's a coincidence. The LHC was broken, and Austria wanted to drop out of CERN. So I had a few challenges at the beginning of my mandate. All countries are still in. We have many more countries, and newcomers show the oldies that there is something worthwhile which they have in their hands, so that helps. We got all our budget, even from countries which had economic problems. So you just have to talk a lot, you have to fly around a lot, and you have to take things serious. You have to talk on the same eye height and try to accommodate things by stretching or etc. At the end, everybody had paid when I left. So it can work.
Yeah, I guess there's a difference between big science projects which you commit to and projects that are linked to an industrial strategy or absence of it. For the big science, I don't think there's ever been any question that the UK would contribute to, in a big way, to major scientific projects like CERN or ESA or other telescopes, all the big science projects. Clearly, the absolute budget is fixed at some point in time, so you have to choose, what to stop if you want to fund something new. But the willingness to participate in big science has always been there for developed nations, and ours being one of them. For projects linked with industrial strategy, it's different country to country. If you're China or India, you have a massive top-down driven policy that is very long in its duration, 30, 40, 50 years, with some, fine adjustments in there, but generally very long with the commitment to stay the course. Here in the UK, we've had very much a market-driven economy, and that applies not just to the nuclear industry, but to other industries as well, where it's been quite difficult to compete because of the short-term nature of the decisions made. I just don't think that in the energy world you can cede all your decisions to the marketplace. You've got to have some decisions taken that are longer than the term of a parliament. And also you've got to remember in the 21st century that energy is tantamount to security. You know, whereas 20, 30, 40 years ago, you could do without power for a while, as we had during things like the miners' strike at the time. Now, you know, society collapses and you've got societal breakdown if you're without power in major cities for more than 24 hours. So, you know, energy security is really important, and I just think we need an adult approach to it. Not everything's cheap. You can't, you know, some technologies are more expensive than others and always will be. Well, I think we've just got to swallow that and have a mix that includes nuclear, that includes wind, that includes solar, that includes marine, that includes all our technologies, and recognise that we want to try and have, you know, the best and the most economic of those in each of the bands, and that we need to do something about carbon capture and storage to enable us to continue with fossil. So that's where I sit. So the hand of ministers is confusing, never static.
But one thing helps. Never promise what you can't deliver.
True.
This is true for both.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure we could continue that debate for a long time, but unfortunately we don't have time. So there is tea. I'm not sure if it's in the buttery. I'm looking to someone who's going to tell me if it's in the buttery or just outside. You will find tea out there somewhere. Can I suggest we come back here for 3:20 by that clock, because that one's 5 minutes slower. So 3:20 by that one, please. Thank you very much. We should thank our speakers again.
Thank you.